Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to Wednesday, apparently. It's just before we jump in here, Irene is here. Good morning, Irene. Michelle is here. Good morning. And Adon is here. Hello, Adon. Yesterday, where were we? Oh, yes. We were talking about the Athenians, and we said they had faced off against the Persian Empire, which is the superpower of this part of ancient history anyway. The Persians invade the Greek mainland, but they're repelled, right? So the Spartans and the Athenians manage to very unexpectedly defeat the Persians and send them home embarrassed, right? And so Darius the One is defeated, or Darius the First is defeated by the Greeks, and apparently he so much wanted revenge against the Greeks that he actually had one of his followers, he's a king of course, he had a guy basically follow him around to remind him, "Sir, remember the Greeks," just so he wouldn't forget how much he hated them. How what? Yeah. So Darius really was unhappy with his defeat and wanted revenge, but again, it's his son Xerxes who will return to attempt to sort of defeat the Athenians again. Some pictures here of the Agora and the sort of Greek influence in the world, and the Pnyx. We talked about all of those things yesterday. Ballot boxes and claritarions. Talked about Greek democracy and women in Athens. Talked about all those things. We said that the Athenians had discovered some silver in their territory and had used it to build ships. And again, those ships are going to come in handy because, like we just mentioned, the Persians are coming back, and they do come back, right? When they do, how do the Athenians defeat them? There you go. 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Yeah, that's exactly what they do. So they abandon Athens itself, and everybody moves themselves to the island of Salamis. And so the Persians enter Athens and they burn it, right? Which again must have been pretty demoralizing and pretty uncomfortable, right? Can you imagine sitting there with all your fellow Athenians watching your city burn, wondering, did we make the right move? I don't know. But of course we know that they did, right? They lure the Persian navy into this kind of narrow strait by Salamis. They send someone to the Persians and say, "Hey, the Greeks are going to run away. You can catch them and destroy them." And the Persians go for it, but unfortunately, that's not what happens, right? The Athenians are ready for them and basically slaughter them all, right? Again, to the point where I don't think the Persians sail home. I think they have to walk home from this battle. So again, it's a fairly chaotic and probably bloody affair with boats ramming other boats, boats being sunk, people shooting arrows and hacking people in the water. It's probably quite a brutal battle. But again, the Athenians come out on top, right? And again, we saw in the documentary, they start kind of wondering, well, why did we win, right? What makes us so special? Because again, even though they were ready this time, they're still kind of the underdog in this fight, right? They're just a small city-state, and you're dealing with the might of the Persian army, right? How did this little group of Greeks manage to defeat a superpower, right? And again, we say the conclusion that they come to is that, well, they must be special in some way, and they're special in their democracy, right? The way that they govern their city-state is totally different from the way any other city-state is governed, right? And so the Athenians start to say, well, maybe it's us, right? We're the difference. We're the X factor. We Athenians do things in a particular way, and that's what makes us so successful. And the documentary sets it up as kind of an opposition between the democratic West and the autocratic or monarchical East. And again, I don't know if that's exactly what it was. I don't know if it was an East versus West sort of situation. But either way, the Greeks start to feel that they're something special. The Athenians start to feel that they're something special. We watched this video yesterday. Do you remember it? Yeah? Can we talk about it? Do you remember enough to talk about it? So we there was two things, right? There was a family that we saw. There was Archaeus was the father, and was it Dexaleia was his wife? Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
Good. Archaeus and what's that? Archaeus and Dexaleia, yeah. So they're a couple, and they have I think 2 or 3 daughters. Archaeus he makes fine clay pots, right? And so we hear a little bit about their life, and then we also hear about there's sort of a democratic event happening in Athens. But let's start with what we learned about the life of Athenian men and boys. What did we see? Right. So the boys are because Archaeus had a son and 2 daughters. Yeah. So we see Archaeus's son is being taught, right, by a teacher. So there's a pedagogos. And so again, when you hear about pedagogy, which is the sort of science of teaching, it comes from the Greek word pedagogos for a teacher. And so yeah, his son is getting an education. A tutor is working with him during the day. What else do we see about? Right. So there's an we can answer both of these questions at the same time. Yeah, there's an education going on for both boys and girls, right? Guys are getting a bit more of a formal education from a teacher, but the girls are getting instructed as well by their mother and by their by a slave, effectively, but someone who works in the household as a housekeeper. What kind of things are girls learning? Yeah, like domestic skills, right? The keeping of a home, how to cook, how to clean things, how to look after children, how to weave cloth, all these kinds of things that women would be expected to do, the girls are going to be taught, right? And the boys are going to be taught a slightly more formal education, but they're also going to be taught a trade, right? So Archaeus is a pot maker. I imagine his son will probably do the same thing, right? Archaeus will teach his son how to make pots as well, probably. What else do we see? Anything else in terms of their family life?
Yeah, the wife only just almost at the end of the day,
Yeah, so it sounded like she was working very hard, right? Dexaleia, and even though they had a housekeeper or a slave housekeeper, however you want to describe her, even though they had one of those, it was still, she was still working pretty hard all day, and took a little break at the end. What else do we see? Okay, so let's move on to the democracy thing. Yeah, we should probably say that too. That formal politics was really the within the sphere of men, right? And of course, when Archaeus went to the assembly for that original piece of business, right, and then came home, his wife had an opinion, right? She was like, "Hey, Archaeus, I heard about what happened at the assembly today, and I think we made a mistake. I think we should do this instead," right? And Archaeus Archaeus agrees with her. Oh yeah, what does Archaeus do that evening?
He goes out with his friends and discuss getting out of his wife's idea.
Yeah, so he talks about his wife idea, but they also have symposia, right? So kind of parties where men sit around and talk politics and drink and things like that, maybe eat some food. That's a symposium, right? And so the Greek men kind of do that sometimes in the evening, get together and talk politics. Right, so what's happening? Anything else? Men make? Yes, Archaeus definitely does. So, yeah, men are the ones who have, for the most part, men are the ones who have professions in Athenian life, right? Women are in the domestic sphere. It's men who have the job, right? Men are the ones who are the makers of things or the doers of things. So what happens in the assembly that morning when Archaeus gets there? What issue is before the assembly? Right. So it concerned a city-state called Mytilene, right? And Mytilene was kind of under the control of Athens, but the Mytilenaeans revolted, right? They revolted against Athenian rule, and the question before the assembly was what to do. What should we do about this? And they decided, like you said, they decided to execute everyone and enslave the women and children. Whew, right? Harsh justice from the Athenians. And so we see a couple of orators get up on stage. They address the assembly and say, this is what we should do, or this is what we should not do. The assembly votes, and they decide to enslave the women and children and execute everyone else. But then what happens? Yeah, there seems to there's after the vote, maybe it was a close vote, the first one, because it seems like a lot of people are unhappy with that decision, right? So there's more conversations that night, of course, at the symposia that Archaeus is at, and his wife Dexalea is opposed to the decision as well. And so there's an emergency meeting held, right? The next night or the next morning, where the assembly again meets, and somebody puts a motion before them saying, I think we made a mistake, guys. I think we should only execute the leaders of the revolt, right? Not everyone. And so again, there's more discussion. The orators are making arguments before the assembly. There's a vote, and the Athenians vote slightly different. They're like, let's just execute the people who planned it, right? The ringleaders. And so, they have to send out another ship to hopefully catch the first one and make sure they don't kill everyone before they get there. A little kind of, a little window maybe. I know it's animated and it's kind of cutesy, but maybe a little world into, what Athenian life might have been like, right? In terms of what the day looked like. And it's interesting to kind of, this is, I think, the hardest thing is, when we watch a documentary like we watched, and we see, Bethany sort of wandering around the ruins and talking about things. One of the things that's hardest to do is just imagine that, there were regular people living their lives in Athens, right? And there are these big historical events, but also, there's just people like Archaeus and Dexalea, right? And them and their 3 children, and Archaeus is making pots, and Dexalea is looking after the kids, and they're going to symposias at night and drinking and talking, and there's a lot of little people who don't really make the history books, but are just kind of living their life, thousands of them, and stories that we will never hear because nobody writes the story of Archaeus and Dexalea. It's just not that it's just not that historically significant. But it's interesting to think about how many kind of just normal people there were living in the ancient world, and people who were kind of normal like you and me, right? People who, any one of us could have been Archaeus and Dexalea, right? Just living our lives in Athens, looking after our kids, going to work, going to the assembly, participating in that, eating, drinking, just kind of living a kind of a normal life, right? And again, it's very easy not to think about that when you're talking about big historical events and wandering through ruins. It's tough to imagine that this was people's lives, right? They lived in this period. So, good morning. The next city-state we should probably talk about is Sparta, right? And Sparta has kind of a mythology all of its own. And so I said if you could think of Athens as, people think of Athens as the birthplace of democracy and of science and of philosophy and logical thought, Sparta has a totally different mystique around it. Part of its mystique is that the Spartans really didn't write anything down on their own. The thing about Fight Club, the first rule of Fight Club is that you don't talk about Fight Club. Well, for the Spartans, the first rule of being a Spartan is you don't talk about being a Spartan. And so most of what we know about Sparta and the Spartans comes from other people talking about them, because the Spartans didn't write anything down of their own. And so, that probably creates a certain amount of bias in terms of how we see these people, because we're always seeing them from the outside, right? The Athenians, we can actually read what the Athenians wrote, and we know what the Athenians were saying about Athenians, right? But the Spartans, we only know what other people said about them. We don't really know what they were saying about themselves. They were kind of like legendarily quiet. They didn't talk a lot. It might be in the video I'll show you, but there's this classic quote where I think it's a Persian city-state threatens the Spartans and says, if the Persian army comes to Sparta, we'll destroy all the Spartans and burn it down so that no one will ever know that Sparta existed. And the Spartans reply, if. So again, they're very classically understated, but they are not to be fooled with, right? They are a military machine, and the Spartans' entire existence is based around becoming the best warriors in the ancient world. And they unquestionably, at least in Greece anyway, they unquestionably are. But they're also weird in a number of different ways. They have a very kind of extreme kind of society, an extreme way of living their lives. Again, Sparta's down here in Laconia. You can tell the Spartans because they always have an L on their shield, which kind of looks like an upside down V. They refer to themselves as Lacedaemonians, and so the Spartans always have an L on their shield. Again, they have a different method of governance. They have some element of elections that happen within Sparta, but for the most part, Sparta is ruled by a council of elders and by two kind of kings, two leaders of the military. And again, the idea is that one king can lead the Spartans into battle, whereas the other one can stay behind and make sure that there is still a king. Everything about Spartan society is engineered to make it a military machine. Okay, so this starts out very early for young boys. Young boys go to a school called the Agoge, and I think they go to the Agoge when they are, I think it's like 8 years old. And so you start your military training as a Spartan at 8. The agoge is brutal, right? It is meant to make you hard and tough. And so the boys at the agoge, they sleep on the ground without without a blanket, right? To make them tough. They are constantly taught to fight and fight with each other. Bullying is encouraged in the agoge because if you're too weak, well, you can't be a Spartan, right? So these are brutal places to grow up. You grow up tough or you don't make it, right? Because the Spartans are all about toughness. Later on, when boys are a little bit older, they stop feeding them. And so the boys are encouraged to go out and they have to steal to get their food. And they're only punished if they get caught. So they learn to be resourceful, they learn to be tough, they learn to be strong and fast. What else should I say about them? Oh, yeah, everything about this society is extreme. There's a classic line from a Spartan mother who her son is about to go off to war, and of course, you know, he might not come back. War in the ancient world is dangerous, and so she's wishing him goodbye to her son, and she says, "Come back with your shield or on it." And so, again, if you come back without your shield, that means that you ran away, right? Because shields are heavy, and so if you chicken out, you ditch your shield and you run for it. And so if you come back without your shield, it means that you ran away, that you were a coward. If you come back on your shield, it's because you're dead and you're, you know, the other soldiers are carrying your body back on your shield. So she says to him, "Come back with your shield or on it," right? Well, again, that comes to us from an outside source, and so I think it's Herodotus that story comes from. So you can take it with a grain of salt. You probably should, but again, it's a very extreme society built on athleticism, strength, bravery, and toughness. Right? That's what the Spartans value, and above all, loyalty to Sparta, right? Sparta comes first. So, again, I've got a little video for us to watch. I've posted it in Microsoft Teams, so online people can watch it as well. So, online people, I'll direct you there. We'll watch this little video, and we'll answer these questions. Hopefully I haven't answered all of them. But why are there no written records from Sparta, and how does that affect how we see them? How are the boys educated? How are the girls educated? What is diamastagosis? What is that? And the ultimate duty of Spartan citizens. Okay, so we'll watch the video quickly and then we'll come back here and talk about it. Okay, so online people, we'll see you in just a few minutes. Yeah, so as you can see, really extreme kind of culture, right? And again, I'm not much into like military stuff really, but I mean, you've got to have a lot of respect for, a city state that would go to this length to turn itself into a military machine, right? To the point of, yeah, babies are examined, and if they don't look strong enough to be Spartan soldiers, they leave them to die, right? And so it's a harsh, brutal society, but I don't know. You've got to have some respect for what they did. I think I probably answered most of these before we started. It was weird. I hadn't watched that video probably since, what month are we in here? March. I probably hadn't watched it since last year, maybe like October or something, but I seem to have remembered quite a bit. But yeah, it's a very interesting society. They also have, has anyone ever heard about um, the sort of the thing about homosexuality in Sparta, in Spartan society? What do you know? Did we or can we? I don't think we did. I think, did we mention it briefly? Yeah. I think, as far as I'm aware, homosexuality in the Greek world was not super uncommon, and it was not, it wasn't seen in such a negative light. But in Sparta, there's actually a formalized kind of homosexuality. Do you know anything about that? No? Yeah, so Spartan men were encouraged to kind of, the older soldiers were meant to form a relationship with younger soldiers in training, and like a physical sexual relationship. And so it was kind of meant to be like a mentor kind of thing, but there was the sex thing involved as well. And it kind of went beyond, like, it wasn't about a gay or straight thing. It was just something that the Spartans did to kind of encourage loyalty between the soldiers, and to kind of create, again, sort of a mentor-mentee kind of relationship. And so it's kind of a weird thing in, looking at it with modern eyes, because we're trying to figure out, oh, well, are these people gay or straight? But I don't think it had anything to really do with that. And really, once this young man was kind of age, once he was officially an adult, he was expected to go out and marry a Spartan woman and have Spartan kids, right? And so it wasn't really about, it wasn't so much about, yeah, it was kind of a different thing. And it's another way in which Sparta is kind of different from other city-states. Yeah, they didn't mention it in there, but again, Sparta is, again, another prominent city-state. It has a fearsome reputation as a military machine, and I think it's very. I think because of that, the sort of myth or the legend of Sparta has become kind of part of Western cultural knowledge, right? How many sports teams are called the Spartans? Tons, right? There's high school teams everywhere that are called the Spartans. Interestingly, my high school team was called the Trojans, after soldiers from Troy, or after the condom brand. But I think it was probably the soldiers from Troy. I hope. I hope. Maybe we got a sponsorship. I don't know. But again, there's lots of sports teams called the Spartans, right? And again, it has to do with that military fearsomeness. And again, sorry, this is just what we saw in the. But sometimes I think you still see reflections of what the Spartans are in kind of modern culture. And has anyone watched any of The Mandalorian? I feel that his character here, this guy, is pretty strongly based in kind of an idea of Sparta, because he belongs to a group of warriors, an entire culture of warriors that put their values as soldiers before everything else. They have a very strict creed that they stick to. And I mean, even there's a lot of visual similarity too, right? Nicholas, have you seen this one? No? It's not a bad series, but again, I think that, you know, the creators of these characters in Star Wars and of this series, I think they drew a lot of inspiration from Sparta, because there are a lot of similarities, right? To the point where this character here talks about, in a few episodes, he talks about his training, and the helmet never comes off. He is not allowed to remove it and show his face to another living person, right? And if he takes it off, if anyone sees him without it, then he's basically out. He can never put it back on again. And so there's this very like extreme culture of, you know, being tough, being a warrior, being like all of those things are mixed in. He doesn't use his real name because he doesn't really have one. He's just a Mandalorian. And so again, he just like a Spartan warrior, his first duty is to Sparta. His first duty is not to himself, but to the other Mandalorians, right? Anyway, there's still reflections of the Spartans showing up in popular culture 2,500 years later. And again, if you watch the show, I think there's a lot of similarity between this character and this sort of idea and what the Spartans were over 2,000 years ago. Whoa. Right. So in the documentary yesterday, we heard about the Athenians were victors over the Persians. They set up a Delian League, which was supposed to be a defensive alliance against the Persians. But over time, well, actually not over time, very quickly, it almost became a little empire for Athens, right? Athens was the strongest one. It had the most warships, and it could kind of bully the other members of the Delian League into doing what it wanted them to do, right? The other members of the league were contributing all kinds of money to Athens, so kind of for protection, if you will. And in turn, Athens protected them, but Athens also took that money and beautified their own city. It's a little bit of misappropriation of funds, if you ask me, but that's what they did. And one politician, Pericles, was very much responsible for that. So he commissioned the building of the Parthenon, right? This complex of buildings on top of the Acropolis in Athens. And so the big building you see there is the Temple of Athena, and Athena, of course, is the patron god of Athens. There's a bunch of other buildings as well, treasuries and sanctuaries and so forth. There it is in color. This is kind of an artist's rendition of what it would have looked like thousands of years ago. So this is what you might have seen in classical Athens if you were standing there. This is it's still pretty impressive today, even over 2,000 years later. And pretty beautiful, even though it's in ruins. Parts of the Parthenon, I think, were stripped away to build modern Athens. I think Greece has also been involved in a couple of wars in which the Acropolis suffered some bombing damage, and so there's a little bit of there's a lot of reconstruction going on, but still pretty impressive, I would say. We don't have any evidence of this, but apparently inside the temple there was a giant statue of Athena that looked maybe maybe something like this. Again, it's not there anymore, but we are told from historical sources that there was a giant statue of Athena inside. So the point of our story, or where we are in the story now, is that Athens is going to go to war. And so, again, they've defeated the Persians twice. They've created a Delian League, which has basically made them the masters of the Aegean. They have all of these other city-states under their control, really except one, right? Sparta is really the only threat in the Greek world to Athenian power, because the Athenians have not been able to bring Sparta under their control. Sparta's not a member of the Delian League. Sparta doesn't have any ships. Nobody messes with Sparta anyway, so they don't need a Delian League. But they're not a member of it, and so the Athenians start to think, we're the masters of the Aegean, except for Sparta, right? They're the only ones who could challenge us. But we could be supreme. We could be the total masters of the Greek world if we could just bring Sparta under our control. And so, again, a motion goes before the assembly to start a war with Sparta, to subdue them and bring them under Athenian control. I'm sure lots of arguments are made, but at the end of the day, the Athenians vote to go to war with Sparta. Okay? This is what the plan is. It's a little different than the Persian plan. The plan is this. They're going to abandon the countryside, and everyone is going to get within the walls of Athens. Okay, so everyone will be behind the wall and protected. All the farmers and people who live outside the walls, they all have to get in so that they're protected. Athens has access to the sea, so they have a port called the Piraeus, I think. And so they can continue to import food into the city. So they don't need to worry about their farms or harvesting anything. They'll be able to bring in food from the sea. And of course, they have mastery of the sea because they have that huge navy. And basically what they're going to do is they're going to hide inside the city, and they're going to use their fleet to sort of sail around and poke at the Spartan army, right? So they're going to sail their ships. They're going to land. They're going to all jump off the ships and hack at the Spartans for a little while, and then they're all going to jump back on their ships and sail away. And they're going to keep kind of doing this. They're going to keep trying to attack the Spartans in different places, have a quick battle with them, and then escape to the sea where the Spartans can't touch them. Because again, the Spartans don't have a navy. So the sides are a little mismatched here, right? They're both masters of their military kind of sphere, but again, the Athenians are masters of the sea, right? They have the warships, they have the talent and the strategy, they know how to use them. But unfortunately, they can't use their navy against the Spartans because the Spartans don't have one. If you want to fight the Spartans, you have to fight them on land. But on land, you can't defeat the Spartans, right? They're too good. And so this is the Athenian plan, to try to use their navy to harass the Spartans at various places and then run away, right? Right. So I have some textbook stuff for you to read, just a few pages on this war called the Peloponnesian War, the war between Athens and Sparta, and kind of how it all shakes out. But maybe we'll take a break before we do that because we've been hardcore for a little while. So take a quick break, come back, and we'll unpack this. All right, people, and we are back. So, as we mentioned just before we went to break, I'd like you to read a short section of the textbook that talks about Peloponnesian War, Athens' decision to declare war on Sparta, and how it went. Okay, so I'll just give you, it's just a few pages here, so maybe I'll just give you about 9 minutes or so to read and to answer these questions, and then of course, as usual, we'll talk about what we read, okay? So let's read that section, answer the questions, then we'll talk. Okay. So there's a lot of kind of extra detail in this section that we probably don't need to worry too much about. Um, but it is interesting to see, the when we have writing from a culture, the level of detail that we actually know, right? We know the names of generals and what they fought and battles that were fought and who betrayed who and who signed the peace treaty and then who violated it. And we've got lots and lots of we've got lots of data, we've got lots of information. And Greece is like that. In particular, Rome is like that as well. There's just tons of writing from Rome. We know a huge amount of what happened, but why does this war go on for so long? This Peloponnesian War.
Because they both had different types of strength, like the
Athenians?
Athenians had the power of the sea,
Hmm.
they had nice navies, and the Spartans, they had the strength on the land.
Hmm.
Since they didn't have any navies, so it took so long during the fight.
Yeah, they are. The two powers are really mismatched, right? Sparta is a land power. The Athenians are a sea power, right? The other thing that's important to note here is that, again, war in the ancient world, for the most part, is different than modern wars, right? Modern wars get fought until somebody wins or until they say, time out, let's have a ceasefire, right? Modern wars just keep going. But in the past, because for the most part it was regular citizens fighting the war, regular citizens had a job back home. So often, two city-states would go to war, they'd fight it out, and then the battle would be won or lost, and then everyone would go home because you still had to harvest the crops. You still had to, sell food in the market. You can't just have everyone leave and go to war for 3 years because the entire city-state will collapse and everyone will starve to death, right? So you've only got a certain amount of time for war, and then everyone has to go back to their day job, right? Because there is no standing army. And so early on, warfare is a very seasonal thing. You go to war when you have time, right? When you're not harvesting the crops. And then, when it's time to get back to work, it's time to get back to work and the battle is over, right? So again, we're kind of used to a war going until somebody wins. Here, they kind of go until someone wins or until they run out of time, right? So again, warfare is a little different, but this one is different still in that it kind of drags on for a long period, right? How did Athens and Sparta change during this period? Let's start with Athens. Athens becomes more democratic. Why does it become more democratic?
Because they need more people to go to vote, and those people have a lower cost, so instead of lower votes, they gain more political influence.
Yeah, so part of your military service that you needed to be an Athenian citizen, once upon a time you had to be able to afford a sword and a shield and a helmet so that you could be a hoplite, right? So you had to have some money. Here, with the ships, you don't need to have any money at all. You just need to have 2 arms so you can help row, right? And so people who wouldn't have been allowed to vote in the past because they didn't have enough money to serve in the military, now it doesn't matter anymore. Now they can actually be a part of the military, and so more people are included in that group of people who vote, right? And poorer people, right? It's not just the upper classes who have money to spend on armor. It's people who have no money at all can suddenly vote and participate, right? So, pardon me, you have more people participating in the democracy. What happens to Sparta? How does Sparta change? How does Sparta change? Yeah, they kind of stop being isolationist, right? They sort of, they're participating more in the Greek world. For the most part, prior to this, the Spartans mind their own business. Sometimes they get drawn into conflicts. Sometimes they're defending Greece against the Persians, like the 300 at Marathon. But for the most part, they keep to themselves. But here, they kind of stop keeping to themselves and they become a little more integrated into the Greek world. And so, how does this war actually come to an end? Who wins? Sparta does, yeah. They don't mention this in the text, but if I recall correctly, Sparta actually gets some help, surprisingly, from the Persians. The Persians have a navy, and the Persians offer part of their navy to the Spartans to help them win. And so that's where Sparta gets its navy. And so they have a few sea battles, but eventually the Spartans cut off Athens from their supply line and forces them to surrender, right? And so the Spartan king who is victorious, Lysander, he tears down Athens' walls and he burns their entire fleet before their eyes, which I'm sure was a traumatic experience for the Athenians, because that's their empire, right? That's their ticket to money and power. And so their entire fleet is burned by the Spartans. And so that's kind of the end of it's the end of Athens as a military power. But what kind of happens to Athens as a result? They're kind of under the control of the Spartans for a while, but eventually they're able to kick the Spartan leaders out. What happens? Does anything happen? Yeah, I guess that is all it says. Maybe I need to give you a little more information here. Yeah, they do try to recover, so they do restore their democracy eventually. But really what happens to Athens is it kind of changes the type of city-state that it is. And so prior to the Peloponnesian War, Athens is kind of an economic powerhouse and a military powerhouse, and so they have a little empire that they've created through the Delian League. But after the Peloponnesian War, they're not a military power anymore. Again, their fleet has been burned, their walls have been torn down, and so they kind of pivot and they become a little more of an intellectual city. They become kind of a center for academics and philosophy and science and learning, and so they kind of become a different type of city, right? Rather than the sort of militaristic empire building that we know from Athens prior. After, they become a little more peaceful and a little more intellectually focused after the war. Okay, there's something I have to talk to you about, and I meant to talk to you about it last week, but I forgot to. I was going to wait a day, and then I felt like I had done it, but I hadn't. And what we had not talked about, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but what we had not talked about is micropapers, right? We're supposed to have 3. The syllabus says we're supposed to have 3, and we really only have time to do the one that I assigned to you already, right? So there's one that's due in a week and a half or so. We won't really have time to do another one after that, right? We'll just have to move on to the final paper. And so the question that I need to ask you is, the first question is that okay that we only have 2 micropapers rather than 3? And should we make any changes to how the grades are kind of weighted? That's my question. So the first question, is it okay that we only have 2 micropapers rather than 3? That's a bit of a rhetorical question because we just don't have time for 3 anyway. So I'm not really asking your permission at this point because I don't think we can do it. We just don't have the time. The question is that now that we only have 2 micropapers, each micropaper is worth 15% rather than 10%. Is that okay? Is that okay? Yeah? Is that a thumbs up from Noah? It's okay. Are there any concerns about that? No concerns? Okay. Online people, do you have any concerns with that? With the reality of that, with only having 2 micropapers and they're worth 15 each? So Basil said he didn't do very well in the first one. Sorry, I'm outing you on that, Basil, but we're if he didn't do very well in the first one, that's possible. But again, I guess if we wanted to account for that, we'd have to make the second one worth more. And do you want to make the second one worth more at the expense of the first one being worth less? So the higher micropaper takes 30%? Ooh, boy, that's pretty extreme. I don't know how crazy I am about that idea. I might be open to the idea of making one worth more, like maybe a 2/3, 1/3 scenario. I might be okay. You like that idea over mine? Yeah, Well, this term I added 3 because I thought we could do it, but sometimes things don't turn out the way you think they're going to. All right. Well, I guess we have two proposals here. I guess we could do a vote. So 2 proposals. Well, technically there's 3 proposals. So one is that basically status quo. We have two micropapers, each worth 15%. That's proposal A, basically. Proposal B is that we do the 2 micropapers are worth kind of a 2/3 split, right? So 2/3 comes from the higher paper, 1/3 comes from the lower paper. Then there is a somewhat more radical proposal in which the highest one takes all of the grade. Right? Does that make sense? So if you have 2 micropapers and you get 70 on one and 50 on the second one, that means that 70% is your grade for the micropapers. Now I have an issue with that. Do you know what my issue is? Yeah, why do the second one? Right? If you did well in the first one.
No, you make half of the second one, you may do more better since you have an idea from the first one. So.
Yeah, but it'd be very tempting if you did well in the first one just to sort of, let it ride, right?
We can agree on that one, but you have to make a deal with you don't do stuff on one.
Yeah, well, no, I'm not going to be more or less. I'm not going to be more or less difficult in my marking based on what we decide here. So I'm going to mark. I'm going to mark as I'm going to mark. I'm not going to try and cook the books from behind the scenes, sort of thing.
What if you just do that but still require us to do something?
You would definitely have to submit a second one. That's why I like the 2/3, 1/3 thing, because there's still an incentive to do.
Yeah, so we're still required to do something, but we'll do his idea.
So could you explain the second one more? The second idea? The people-
My second idea was that so if you have two micropapers, one's worth 70, one's worth, or not one worth, okay, let's say you get a 70% on one and a 50% on the other. I will figure it out so it's 2/3 of your micropaper mark comes from the higher one, 1/3 comes from the lower one. I feel like I like that one better because again, I don't want to have a situation where people would just say, "Oh well, screw it. I'll take my higher mark." Because again, let's be real. I would probably do that if I was you. If I had the ability to do that in a class and I got like a good mark on my first paper.
Maybe you just have to require to make one, and if no one can, and if a person doesn't make it, then you can just reduce the grade.
Yeah, but I don't want to read a bunch of junk either. That's the problem. I don't want to have people like just submitting anything because they have to submit it, and then I've got to read all of this undercooked stuff.
Or you can do like assessments right now, the two ideas, and then you see how people perform. If they do it weirdly, so you do your second idea. If they do it better, you go for his idea.
No, just leave it.
You keep it like a suspense and then see the results. And
Suspense.
then we discuss it later after submitting and getting all grades.
I guess that's possible. Like,
If we're not doing this one, then just keep it.
if what?
If we're not doing his idea, just keep it.
If we're not doing
His idea.
If we're not doing that, so if we're not doing all or nothing, then we just keep it 50-50?
Leave the highest, leave the highest.
Or keep it like a suspense and wait for the results and then we see.
I'd really rather, I could do it that way. Okay. Here's what I'll do. And again, you can let me know. So Amanpreet's suggestion is that we not decide now. You hand in your micropapers, I mark them, and I kind of look at the spread between the two marks, okay? And so if they look like, people tried hard and tried to do a good job, then we can do the all or nothing situation. If people wrote, a bunch of, random stuff just to turn something in, then I'm going to do the 2/3, 1/3 thing. I don't really like that one though, because I would rather us be in agreement. I don't want to base the decision based on what I see in the marks, because then you're going to be like there's too much, like people are trying to figure out how it might work out, and I don't like that so much. I'd rather everybody know what's going to happen going in rather than it being kind of, because what if I mark it and I say, oh, they weren't that good, so I'm going to do it this way, and then everyone comes and says, oh, but we tried really hard, we want you to do it the other way, and then it's kind of too late.
Maybe we discuss
Discuss
it in class.
it in class when?
After like marking and then they see the results and decide the way we do it.
I'd really rather what you're getting into before.
If you do the 2/3, 1/3,
What's that?
if you do the 2/3, 1/3, then you'll make the first micropaper 1/3 and the other 2/3.
Whichever one is higher, I will make 2/3.
Okay, that's good.
That's stressful for us. And you do know if someone is really trying, if they got a bad mark in the first one.
Yeah, well, if you got a bad mark on the first one, then yeah, there would be a lot of incentive to do well on this one.
You could potentially see some really good papers.
I could. I'm just nervous about that, and I'm nervous about putting so much on one thing as well. Even because the idea of these micropapers was that you get a few test runs before you do the final paper, right? So I don't want to put so much weight on one of them, because I do want, like the problem is it has to be okay. It has to be, to some degree, it has to be okay for you to fail, right? It has to be okay for you to do not so great a job at something so that you can do a better job later. That's part of how learning works. If you never fail at anything, you're not learning, because you already know it. You're just doing things you already know. You're not stretching at all. So I don't like to put quite so much emphasis on I think I'd like to keep it the same, or I'd like to do the 2/3, 1/3 thing. I don't think I want to go. I appreciate your suggestion, and it makes sense where you're sitting, but I have concerns. And again, I know if I was in your seat and that was the arrangement, I know how I'd play it, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. You guys have to prioritize. You have to do a cost-benefit analysis in terms of how much work for how much grade. I get that, right? I spent 11 years in university. Like, I get how to do the mental calculation there, but that's what I'm also worried about, is that it will be detrimental to what you're trying to do. So I think if it's okay with everyone, maybe even if it's not, I'd like to do the 2/3, 1/3 thing. So I'll mark your second micropaper. Whichever one has the higher grade will be 2/3 of the micropaper grade. The lower one will be just 1/3. So you will get a little bit of a bump up one way or the other, and you will, if you didn't do well in the first one, you have an opportunity to pull up. If you did well in the first one, you can always try and aim for the same thing so it won't bring you down. If you do better, then it can pull you up too. But I think there's still some incentive there, but either way you're going to get a little bit of a lift from that 2/3, 1/3, particularly because the 2/3 will come from whichever one's higher. Will that be okay? Okay. Again, I appreciate your idea, but it scares me a little bit. And I get it, but yeah. Okay. I am sorry that I didn't talk to you about that a little bit earlier. We talked about it in social justice because it's kind of the same situation, but I didn't want to talk about it on the same day. I meant to talk about it a day after, and then I kind of forgot that we hadn't talked about it yet. So, okay, I'm glad we did that. That is all I have for you today. Come back tomorrow. We'll talk about Daedalus and Icarus, and then just a little more about Athens, I think. But that is all I have for you today. So have a nice afternoon. Try and get some sun if you can. It's good for vitamin D. And I'll see you tomorrow.